Welcome to BeFM Drama, where we turn great literature into gripping radio. In today's episode, we bring you the final part in our 5-part adaptation of The Adventure of the Abbey Grange, a classic Sherlock Holmes mystery. Holmes and Watson have investigated the brutal murder of Sir Eustace Brackenstall at Abbey Grange, a stately country house. His wife and maid told a detailed and convincing story about the burglars who had done the murder, but Holmes has discovered that this case is not as it seems. Lady Mary Brackenstall and her maid Theresa Wright made up a story of the burglary to cover for the real killer, a ship's captain named Crocker. Crocker has just arrived at Holmes and Watson's apartment at Baker Street, and he has a powerful story to tell. Captain Crocker was seated in an armchair, but it barely seemed to contain his concentrated, fiery energy. He looked around at us defiantly, without the slightest trace of remorse in his eyes when Sherlock Holmes declared him a murderer.
What are you going to do with me? Arrest me? Speak out, man. You can't sit there and play with me like a cat with a mouse. Give him a cigar, Watson. Bite on that, Captain Crocker, and don't let your nerves run away with you. I should not sit here smoking with you if I thought that you were a common criminal. You may be sure of that. Be frank with me, and we may do some good. Play tricks with me, and I'll crush you. What do you wish me to do? To give me a true account of all that happened at Abbey Grange last night. A true account, mind you, with nothing added and nothing taken off. I know so much already that if you go 1 inch off the straight, I'll blow this police whistle from my window and the affair goes out of my hands forever.
Captain Crocker thought for a little. Then he struck his leg with a great sunburned hand.
I'll chance it. I believe you're a man of your word, and so I'll tell you the whole story. But one thing I will say first. As far as I'm concerned, I regret nothing, and I fear nothing, and I would do it all again and be proud of the job. Darn the beast, if he had as many lives as a cat, he would owe them all to me. But it's the lady, Mary Fraser. I'll never call her by Brackenstall, that accursed name. And when I think of getting her into trouble, it turns my soul into water. And yet, what less could I do? I'll tell you my story, gentlemen, and then ask you man to man, what else could I have done?
Crocker's story took us back nearly 2 years, to when he was first officer of the Rock of Gibraltar and Mary Fraser was her passenger. From the first day he met her, she was the only woman for him. Every day of that voyage he loved her more and smiled in the darkness of his long night watches, knowing that she was sleeping peacefully below decks. She was never engaged to him. She treated Crocker as a friend, and he had no complaint to make. It was all love on his side, good comradeship and friendship on hers. When they parted, she was a free woman, but Crocker knew that he'd never be a free man again in his heart. He shook his head ruefully, thinking on the memory.
The next time I came back from sea, I heard of her marriage. Well, why wouldn't she marry whom she liked? Title and money. Who could carry her better than she? She was born for that life. I didn't grieve over her marriage. I was not so selfish as that. I just rejoiced that good luck had come her way, and that she had not thrown herself away on a penniless sailor. That's how I loved Mary Fraser.
Crocker never thought to see her again. But on his last voyage, he was promoted to captain, and the new boat had not yet launched, so he had to wait for a couple of months with his company at Sydenham. One day, walking on a country lane, he met Theresa Wright, the lady's old maid. She told him all about her and about her husband.
I tell you, gentlemen, it nearly drove me mad, this drunken hound, that he should dare to raise his hand to her, whose boots he was not worthy to lick. I met Theresa again, and then I met Mary herself, and I met her again. Then she would meet me no more. But the other day I had a notice that I was to start on my voyage within a week, and I determined that I would see her once before I left.
Nurse Wright had always been Crocker's friend, and she loved the lady almost as much as he did, and hated her husband. From her, Crocker learned the ways of the house at Abbey Grange. The Lady Mary liked to sit up late reading in her own little room downstairs. On the night of the murder, Crocker had entered the grounds, crept around to the window, and scratched at it. At first, Mary would not open to him, but in his heart he knew that she loved him and could not leave him standing alone in the frosty night. She whispered to him to come around to the big front window, and he found it open. Crocker stepped through into the dining room. Again he heard from his lady's lips the things about her husband and the abuses she suffered that made his blood boil, and again he cursed the brute who mishandled the woman he loved. It was at that moment that Crocker arrived at the climax of his tale.
Well, gentlemen, I was standing with Mary just inside the window, in all innocence, as God is my judge, only talking, when her husband rushed like a madman, called her the vilest name that a man could use to a woman, and smacked her across the face with a stick he carried in his hand. I went for the poker by the fire, and it was a fair fight between us. See here on my arm, the bruise where his first blow fell. But then it was my turn, and I put that poker through his skull as though it had been a rotten pumpkin. Do you think I was sorry? Not I. It was his life or mine, but before that it was his life or hers, for how could I leave her in the power of that madman? That was how I killed him. Was I wrong? Well, then what would either of you gentlemen have done if you had been in my position?
Mary had screamed when her husband struck her, and that brought Nurse Wright down from the room above. There was a bottle of wine on the sideboard, and Crocker opened it and poured a little between Mary's lips, for she was half dead with shock. Then he took a drink himself. Nurse Wright was cool as ice, and it was her idea to make it appear that burglars had done the murder. The nurse kept on repeating the story to her mistress so that she'd remember it, while Crocker climbed up and cut down the bell rope. He tied the lady in her seat and frayed the end of the rope to make it look natural, so that the police would not wonder how in the world a burglar could have gotten up there to cut it. Then Crocker and the nurse gathered up a few plates and pots of silver to make it look like there'd been a robbery, and Crocker left again through the window. Crocker dropped the silver into the pond and made his way back to Sydenham, feeling that for once in his life he'd done a truly good night's work. 15 minutes after the captain slipped away, Nurse Wright raised the alarm and the police were called to Abbey Grange.
And that's the truth, and the whole truth, Mr. Holmes, if it costs me my neck.
Holmes smoked for some time in silence. Then he crossed the room and shook our visitor by the hand.
Well, Captain, I know that every word is true, for everything you've said rings true with what I've seen. No one but an acrobat or a sailor could have gotten up to cut that bell rope, and no one but a sailor could have tied the knots in which the rope was fastened to the chair. Only once had the lady been in contact with sailors, and that was on her voyage from Australia. It was also clear by the lengths she went to shield him that she was in love with this sailor. You see how easy it was for me to lay my hands upon you once I had started down the right trail. I thought the police would never see through our deception. The police haven't, nor will they, to the best of my belief. Now look here, Captain Crocker, this is a very serious matter, although I am willing to admit that you acted under extreme provocation. In court it might even be pronounced a legitimate act of self-defense. However, that is for a British jury to decide. Meanwhile, I have so much sympathy for you that if you chose to disappear within the next 24 hours, I can promise you that no one will hinder you. And then the truth will all come out. Certainly it will come out.
The sailor flushed with anger.
What sort of proposal is that? I know enough of law to understand that Mary would be held as an accomplice. Do you think I would leave her alone to face the music while I snuck away? No, sir. Let them do their worst upon me, but for heaven's sake, Mr. Holmes, find some way of keeping my poor Mary out of the courts.
Holmes, for a second time, held out his hand to the sailor.
I was only testing you, and you ring true every time. Well, it is a great responsibility to take upon myself, but I have given Hopkins an excellent hint, and if he can't make use of it, I can do no more. See here, Captain Crocker, we'll do this in due form of law. You are the prisoner. Watson, you are a British jury, and I never met a man who was more eminently qualified to represent one. I am the judge. Now, gentlemen of the jury, you have heard the evidence. Do you find the prisoner guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty, my lord.
Vox populi, vox Dei, the voice of the people is the voice of God. You are acquitted, Captain Crocker. So long as the law does not accuse an innocent of the crime, you are safe from me. Come back to your lady after your next voyage, and may her future and yours justify us in the judgment which we have made tonight.
With that, Holmes has pronounced his own judgment, leaving the murderer of Sir Eustace Brackenstall free from the hands of the law. The real killer of the Lord of the Abbey Grange was a seasoned sailor and ship's captain named Crocker, who had loved the Lady Brackenstall since their first encounter on her voyage from Australia to England. Crocker did what he had to do to protect the woman he loved from a violent, drunken abuser, and in the eyes of Sherlock Holmes, his actions were justified, even if the law of England would consider him a murderer. And so we come to the end of this tale, another murder solved and justice gained in the final episode of The Adventure of the Abbey Grange here on BeFM Drama.